Welcome to Conversations for Change. I'm Dr. Kay Wise Whitehead, the host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA, and the founder of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice, and an associate professor for communication in African and African American studies at Loyola University, Maryland. On behalf of Maryland Public Television, Morgan State University, and the University of Maryland Global Campus, welcome to our Women's History Month celebration. We are focusing on Black women's suffrage, and we are delighted to have you with us this evening. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer once said, sometimes it seems like to tell the truth today is to run the risk of being killed. But if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom because I'm not backing off. Her fight for freedom was discussed during that short clip that you just saw. Now, it's important to note that Black women have long been at the forefront of the right to vote. Today, 101 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment, which prohibited the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens of the United States on the basis of sex, really allowed white women free and unrestricted access to the ballot. It's 56 years after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But no matter how we look at it, their fight, our fight, continues today. Now let's be clear, the 19th Amendment did not guarantee any woman the vote. Instead, laws reserving the ballot for men became unconstitutional. Women, Black women in particularly, Asian American women in particularly, Hispanic women in particularly, still had to fight through a web of state laws designed to keep them from the ballot, including restrictions based upon age and citizenship and residency and race. Race was a factor. One historian in particular whose work illuminates many of the issues that Black women had to go through to get access to the ballot is Dr. Rosalind Terboy Penn, who in 1969 began teaching at Morgan State University. She developed the first PhD program for history students. Now, Dr. Terboy Penn brought to light the phenomenal efforts of Black women to secure the vote for women in the United States. Let's take a moment to listen to this clip about Dr. Rosalind Terboy Penn. Dr. Terboy Penn was a forerunner. She was brilliant, she was bright, she was amazing.
She was also very kind and considerate.
Unrelenting.
She was everything Black. And that's why she was thrilled to be teaching at a historically Black college. I think had she been at a predominantly white institution, they may have tried to mute her. At Morgan, again, she was legendary. She was a giant. Everyone respected her. You could have those open discussions about race and not have to worry about what anyone else is going to say or have to worry about any conflict.
Dr. Penn made African American women's history a thing. It was a slow and gradual process of taking history back from others.
She helped to train up the next generation of scholars who focus on Black women's history, who understand why it's important for us to be the keepers of our story.
There's an art form to writing good history that grabs your attention. And Dr. Penn was the first person, I think, who really began to open up that doorway to me. Dr. Penn would sometimes bring in a primary source document. She would discuss the document within a broader context, and that made it come alive.
She would be so glad to see that the baton has been passed on to a generation who are more than ready to carry it across the finish line.
Her footprint is literally across the globe. I would challenge you to go to anybody's college or university campus, and there isn't someone that in some way, shape, or form has been either touched directly or indirectly by Dr. Penn's life, her work, or her classroom.
I just find it really hard to find someone who knew her, who was not influenced in a positive way by having her in their lives.
I'm trying to compose myself so I don't go into tears.
Dr. Terborg Penn inspired me to stand in a space that's typically filled with white men and say, I belong here. My work is important, and the history of Black women is just as, if not more, important than the histories that are typically told.
Dr. Penn inspired me to give voice to the voiceless thousands of Black women who have existed, and their stories have gone yet untold.
She lived life without regret, made no apologies for who she was or what she was pursuing.
She was her story in motion. You can continue to keep these efforts for future scholars by visiting the Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn's Endowed Scholarship Fund at morgan.edu. That sister taught us how to stand up straight in a crooked room. I want to turn our attention to 1972. Just go back with you for just a moment. Now, Shirley Chisholm became the first Black major party candidate to run for president of the United States of America. Shirley Chisholm, who talked about bring your own chair when they tell you there's no room for you at the table. In the 1972 U.S. presidential election, she became the first woman to ever run for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. It was a powerful moment for Black women. It was a powerful moment for women. Let's take a look at Dr. Sister Shirley Chisholm.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America. I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman, and I'm equally proud of that. I am not the candidate of any political bosses or fat cats or special interests. I stand here now without endorsements from many big-name politicians or celebrities or any other kind of prop. I do not intend to offer to you the tired and glib cliches which for too long have been an accepted part of our political life. I am the candidate of the people of America. Fellow Americans, we have looked in vain to the Nixon administration for the courage, the spirit, the character, and the words to lift us, to bring out the best in us, to rekindle in each of us our faith in the American dream. Yet all that we have received in return is just another smooth exercise in political manipulation, deceit and deception, callousness and indifference to our individual problems, and the disgusting playing of divisive politics, pitting the young against the old, labor against management, North against South, Black against white.
Sister Shirley Chisholm. It's interesting, that was 1972. Now, to put that in context, that was the first year that Joe Biden entered the Senate, and Kamala Harris was in second grade. History is not the past. It is the present. I want to introduce our panelists, and I want to invite you to put your questions into the chat so we can have this conversation. Joining me tonight is Dr. Toya Corbett, an assistant vice president for student affairs at the University of North Carolina System, a graduate of Morgan State University, and the author of the Morgan State University Women, the First 60 Years, 1934 to 1994. We're also joined by Professor Gloria Brown Marshall, She is a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the author of several books, including the most recent one, She Took Justice, The Black Woman Law and Power, 1619 to 1969. And Dr. Damon Freeman, the director of the History and African American Studies program at the University of Maryland Global Campus and a graduate of Morgan State University. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And Dr. Freeman, I'll start with you. What is the connection with Dr. Terborg Penn and the topic that we are discussing here today?
Well, thank you for that question, Dr. K, and thank you to the organizers for having me on this panel. I think it's important to know that when Dr. Penn began her research in the 1970s on the topic of Black women and the suffrage movement, she was moving into a field where that virtually did not exist, right? And first of all, there was not that much scholarship on Black women. We're still talking about the early to mid 1970s at that point. And there wasn't all that much scholarship either on the mainstream women's suffrage movement itself. And so to ask those questions about what is the role of Black women, her work was path-breaking. For most people who thought about the suffrage movement, they didn't consider the Black women to be involved in the suffrage movement at all. They were invisible. And as far as the relationship with Black men, with the exception of Frederick Douglass, most people thought that Black men were opposed to suffrage for women. So her work was really path-breaking at the time, and I think that's important for us to keep in mind.
Now, Dr. Corbett, I'll come to you because Dr. Freeman just mentioned Frederick Douglass, and I immediately thought about when Frederick Douglass stood up and said, "I'm a woman's rights man." Can you make the connection for us about the impact of Dr. Terborg Penn's work on the Black women's suffrage movement? How did the two connect with each other?
Absolutely. First, I want to thank you all for the invitation for this panel. You know, as a former student of Dr. Penn, we learned all about, you know, her research, which on this topic started when she was at graduate school at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And, you know, she began to do a little research. And as Dr. Freeman said, you know, she didn't find a lot. But in her mind, she knew that Black women were involved. But because Black women were written out of history, it was hard to find documentation. But being Dr. Penn, she began to dig and dig and dig. And her life's work culminated in publishing her book, African American Women in the Struggle for the Vote, 1850 to 1920, which is, to me, is the book about Black women in the suffrage movement. And she really uncovers the voices and makes known to the world women like Sojourner Truth and Marianne Shadd and Frances Harper and Mary Church Terrell and Nannie Helen Burroughs and their role in the women's suffrage movement. And she also talks about how women mobilize and organize regionally and nationally, whether it be in church or on college campuses or in their communities. She used that reference to talk about the intersectionality that was involved with Black women in the suffrage movement, with gender, race, and class. And she pulled it all together in her book, which is her life work. And she talked about that everywhere she went. And she talked about it in the classroom, and she was invited to many lectures. But women's suffrage was definitely Dr. Penn's life work. And I always said that 2020 would have been her year had she not passed, that the world would have known about her because her book probably would have been reprinted again and read by everyone, because talking about from then until now.
Now, I want to ask you a follow-up, Dr. Corbett, because you said earlier, you just said you dig and dig and dig to find the histories. As a historian and someone who studied under Dr. Terborg Penn, can you talk about why it's important for us to reclaim the voices of Black women and pull them into the annals of the historical discussion?
It's so important to reclaim or to uncover those names and those voices that were written out, were never included in history to begin with, You were made to believe that Black women did not have a role in building this country or in suffrage movement or any other movement. And Dr. Penn taught us to do that. You know, she inspired us to give voice to the voiceless. She would spend hours and hours in the archives. You know, then there was no Google. There was no internet. You know, you had to go to the library. You went to the Library of Congress, or you went to the National Archives, and you did your research. And that was what she loved to do. When she found something new, you know, it felt like you hit the lottery. As my fellow historians, you know, you've had that thrill. And me too. But Dr. Penn wanted to uncover those voices. She writes that in her book when she says, I wanted them to tell their own stories from that African feminist or Black women's lens and no one else.
I want to go to Professor Brown Marshall as both a historian and a lawyer, you know, writing about Black women and the suffrage movement. Can you make the connection for us? Because some people don't recognize the tension that existed between Black and white women over this suffrage issue that goes back to the early days. Can you talk about the disconnection for us?
Yes, and I'd like to say that I stand on her shoulders, because my work dealing with women and she took justice was because, even though I'm speaking through a legal historian lens, that lens is opened up by the work that she's doing in working on, or she's done working on women's history. So back in the 1800s, what we find, because of enslavement of Black women, we also have free Black women. We have women who made themselves free, like Sojourner Truth, who was mentioned before, who said that she didn't escape from slavery, she left. And she left in broad daylight. That's how powerful Black women were. And so when white women met in 1848 in Seneca Falls in upstate New York to decide that they're going to have their Declaration of Rights, the only Black person there was Frederick Douglass. And he was the one who told the white women that if you don't put voting rights in your declaration, then your declaration means nothing, because it means nothing without the right to vote. However, where were the Black women? I have to ask myself, Fred, where was your wife, that Black woman at the time? So my question then becomes, as we go forward, these white women who want equal rights to men and the right to vote do not want Black women to be in their organizations. So what do? Black women do what we've always done. We go out and make our own. And so we created our own suffragist organizations for fighting for the right for the vote. But then Black men gained the right to vote in 1870 with the 15th Amendment. And Frederick Douglass, who was a friend of Frances Willard and a friend of this white women's movement, said Black men deserve the right to vote before white women. Well, women like Frances Willard and others said they would rather cut off their right arm than have Black men gain the right to vote before white women gained it. And then you see these horrific things like Alice Paul and other white suffragettes were saying about Black men that they would, you know, attack. And then white women wanted to connect with the Southern white women in this political action. And they said they're going to continue the lie that Ida B. Wells Barnett, another suffragette, revealed, that it was not the attacks on white women that caused lynching. It was competition. It was jealousy. It was putting Black people back in their place through these horrific murders. And so lynching, the racism, the same classism that was in effect before was in effect during this movement up to 1920 between Black women and white women. But as we always do, we started our own, from Sojourner Truth to Ida B. Wells Barnett and all the women in between. And that tension lasts to this day, because even in the feminist movement, there's still the tension where white women believe that they should run the programs and everyone else of color who are women should follow.
Thank you. I just want to take that to Dr. Freeman, because to follow up on what Professor Brown Marshall kind of spelled out in bringing up that Susan B. Anthony quote about, you know, I'd rather cut off my right arm than demand the ballot for Black men rather than for women. Can you just illuminate for us, Dr. Freeman, that tension that existed then, and in some ways it even exists today? Can you connect both of the past to the present?
Yes, well, Dr. Brown Marshall already has gone over quite a bit of this, but one thing I think that can be added to that is it didn't always necessarily start out that way. I mean, if we go back before the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention to the anti-slavery conventions in the 1830s, we see there's a lot of overlap between the struggle for women's rights and the struggle against slavery. But as the issues begin to escalate, there's a split that develops. And as it's already been said, when you have the 15th Amendment that seems to create this permanent split, and the Black women at that point are left to create their own organizations, which you see with the Women's Club movement in the 1890s. And those organizations in particular, I think, are crucial to understand how, if you want to understand the history of Black women in voting, you have to look at what's happening with the club, the Women's Club movement in the 1890s, and connect that to the fight for voting rights. So it is taking a different route than what you see with the mainstream women's movement, but it's at the same time it's a route that's also overlaid with issues about economic independence, concerns about lynching, and so forth. So there's that needs to be taken into consideration as well.
Now, Dr. Corbett, there's always been a challenge around this issue of voting rights. And a number of questions are coming up in the chat about voting rights, or people are very concerned. But I want to start with you. If you can just lay out for us the consistent challenge to voting rights, and then Professor Brown-Marshall, I want to come to you and talk about voter suppression. So what is the consistent challenge to voting rights here?
Consistent challenge to voting rights is they want to keep us from voting. You know, historically, there has always been resistance to the Black vote. You know, I think now, particularly when they saw how we were able to unify, and we have finally learned that when the Black community comes together, what we can achieve. And now they are very fearful. I would say they, maybe the Republican Party, are those who are against the Black community moving forward. The challenge to voting rights is to disenfranchise us again, which, you know, is kind of becoming full circle from the 1800s until now. And I think with the redlining for communities, and also challenging voter ID. I'm in North Carolina, in a state that there are consistent challenges to voting rights. And I think Dr. Penn in her work talked about this again with the disenfranchisement of women or Black men. I mean, the same thing is happening today, and we just need to be mindful of what those are. Because when you're not paying attention, and that's when they put things through, just like that happened in Georgia last week.
So I want to come to you, Professor Brown-Marshall. If you could lay out for us first, just the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so people can really understand that, and then talk about the pattern to voter suppression.
Voter suppression started as soon as we started voting. If you think about the 15th Amendment was enacted in 1870. Our first Black U.S. Senator was in 1870, Hiram Revels. And between the time period of 1870 to 1900, we had over 4,000 Black men in elected offices. No women could vote at this time, white, Black, or otherwise. But here's the problem. As soon as you have this political power, you have the backlash. And that's the consistent pattern here. You have power, you have backlash. And so by 1890, you have the Mississippi Convention. That Mississippi Convention where we have Vardaman, who says, basically, we're not here because of fraud. We're here because of the N-word. So they started the grandfather clause. They started the literacy tests, the poll taxes, because of the power of the Black vote. We know in the 1870s, the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana, in which Black men who had voted were meeting to decide how they were going to use their political power, and they were then massacred. They still to this day don't know how many hundreds were massacred in Colfax, Louisiana during that time period. So you see this push forward and the push back. And so it takes until 1965, after even more murders, the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that was stopped, and the horrific view of the world on those people who were silently marching and attacked by people in Alabama, in Selma, Alabama, that President Johnson then decides we must have a Voting Rights Act. And so this 1965 Voting Rights Act not only speaks to the protection of the vote for people of color, especially African Americans, but also the jurisdictions in which you have this terrorism around the vote, such as Georgia, Alabama, et cetera. And so there's a provision in it. That's the most important provision that this nation has seen in civil rights. That means that any jurisdiction that wants to change its voting rights laws has to have it approved by the federal government, by either a 3-judge federal court or the attorney general. So this means that they cannot change anything when it comes to voting rights if they find it's going to be discriminatory, and that has to be determined by the federal government. This gives rise to the Congressional Black Caucus, which then gives rise, of course, to where we are now with a Black and Asian vice president. But without that provision in the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted in 2013, June, I was in the U.S. Supreme Court when it happened, and devastated the protections that we had that were crucial to protecting our right to vote. And so that Voting Rights Act was necessary for us to expand our right to vote and for politicians to get in office, for us to vote for whom we wanted to vote. And it didn't mean that we didn't have U.S. Supreme Court cases, dozens of them, but we had that core protection that has now been taken away, and we're seeing the result of it to this day.
And so, Dr. Damon, then can you connect it? Because in talking about what Professor Brown Marshall just laid out and the ways in which sections of the Voting Rights Act has been gutted, the ways in which they're talking about the Voting Rights Act again in Section 2 in the Supreme Court now, and then with Georgia with the passage of SB 202. Can you talk about the further erosion of the protection of our voting rights that we see happening now and what we can do about it?
That was me. I'm sorry.
Yes, Dr. Damon, if you could.
Okay. Yes. Sorry about that. Yes. So there's certainly, it's with the Supreme Court having overruled Section 2 unconstitutional of the Voting Rights Act. That is absolutely an incredibly important aspect to it. The thing that I think also that's important for us to keep in mind is how even though people have been pushing all along for voting rights, that all of these things are operating in a continuum. And so I think when you look at people in the past like Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and others, there's not, they would have seen also that there's not a straight line from going from one end until you get to progress and the eventual victory at the other end, but that there's a constant back and forth and a push here, shove there, and so forth. And I think it's also important to keep in mind how these things also overlap with each other. So, for example, the struggle to gain union rights at the Amazon plant in Bessemer, Alabama, I wonder if that is connected to the political organizing that happened over the last couple of years to get Doug Jones elected, for example, to the U.S. Senate in Alabama, since so much of that depended on what Black women were doing. So there are a lot of connections and there's a lot of overlap between the different periods. Yeah.
Dr. Toya, I want to come to you. So a question that comes up from the audience is that there are life and death issues in the Black community, which I think we can all testify to that. Even while we're going through the Chauvin trial, there are life and death issues. And if voting, according to this person here, voting solves none of these problems, then what of the vote? The question around why do we vote, with Professor Brown Marshall, I'm going to come to you to answer that one as well. What of the vote?
You know, Dr. K, as someone in higher education, I would hear that a lot from students because they, in their mind, they are of a generation that has not, I think until last year, had really, seen a struggle of our community or went through any type of movement until the Black Lives Matter movement, so to say. And I think because of the prior election, not the most recent one, they felt defeated. And sometimes they really do believe their vote does not matter. And this is just not for young people. This is just for all people who still continue to not vote. And when you do that, you are giving the other side a vote. We constantly, talk about that. But when you look at what's happening now, it is so important that we vote in every election and not just national elections, local elections, state elections, for judges, your mayor, your police chiefs. All of those do matter because, as you can see, there has been a process put together in those local elections going up that really do push us, that try to encourage us not to vote by the not sharing of information. People do not read, or they believe everything that's on Facebook or Instagram. And so they have in their mind that, it does not matter. But when it really does matter, if we do not vote, then we are giving away our rights. We are really spitting in the face of those that marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that walked through Selma and all through the South for the right to vote. And I think that it is important that we understand what the issues are and how we can impact those in every single state and every single community in this country.
Now, Professor Brown Marshall, I want to come to you. I know you're ready for this question because people often say if the vote wasn't so important, then they wouldn't be working so hard to suppress it. That the punitive nature of SB 202, when you start talking about giving people water and food and just the pettiness of it, can you just lay out for us why people should vote? Because we're still having the question about whether or not people should vote.
Well, I had a chance to work under C.T. Vivian, who was lieutenant under Martin Luther King. He wrote the foreword for my book, The Voting Rights War. And it is a war. And it's a war of attrition. It's a war of values. And it's an on-the-ground war because the person who controls the vote controls the voice of the community. And from the 1600s, when we had Mary and Anthony Johnson, who had property as Africans in the Virginia colony, they should have had the right to vote. But then the laws changed to take away that right to vote. And so every time we do what's correct, do what the rules say, then something happens with the backlash to take away our right to vote, because that voice determines from dog catcher to prosecutor to mayor how the resources in the communities will be divided up. And so if we want to give away that money, we're putting tax money into other people's hands. And then by not voting, we're saying, you use my money any way you please. I really don't care. So I have money put into the pot. I want a voice as to how that money is going to be spent. And so our communities need all types of resources. That resource money is our tax dollar. Those politicians divvy up that tax money based on their priorities. And if we choose certain by not voting certain politicians to be in office, we're choosing their priorities as well. And when it comes to our priorities, we should understand from our children to our elders, everything is political. So everything involves that money we put into the pot. We also need to understand that women have been organizing to use their resources to help the community. Those women's clubs back in the 1800s were women's clubs for social uplift. They were there for education. They were there for everything from personal hygiene to whether or not people were being fed. So we've always been able to try to do these things on our own, but our government has a much larger pot. We've put the money into the pot, and we should use our vote to make sure that money is given to our communities where we need that money to go, and not just given away to others. And I'll end with this last part with this question. We need to realize, and I say this in my voting rights book, we have voting rights martyrs. We have people who were murdered just for registering to vote. who, just like Fannie Lou Hamer, was beaten in jail and her life shortened because she was trying to get people to realize they had the right to vote. We need to understand that this vote came with blood, sweat, and tears, and it continues to do so to this very moment. And we need to not have this sense of voting is supposed to be some spiritual movement. You go into the voting booth and you're supposed to see Jesus. What you're supposed to do is your civic duty as a citizen. Realize that being a voter is part of life in any country, and it's our civic obligation and obligation to our communities.
Now I'm laughing because my Nana felt like she saw Jesus when she was voting for Obama. So I'm just saying, some people
can't have it every time, though.
Yeah, not every time. So Dr. Damon, I know you wanted to respond to that. If you could, and then I want you to make a connection once you respond to that for me.
Oh, just a quick follow-up to that. It's also important to remember that jury pools are drawn from voter lists, right? So if you're not voting, then you can't get on juries. And so you can't hold police officers accountable when you do, like what's happening in Minneapolis right now. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Well, that's what I really wanted you to illuminate on, because there's some people, Dr. Damon, who take the exact same thing that Professor Brown Marshall just said, but they turn and say, you know what, my ancestors died, so I can choose whether I want to participate. Not just so I can vote, but I can make the choice. Can you talk about how, with the last election in particular, with 74 million people voting for Donald Trump, and what that says about our country, why it's even more important, not just to say, well, I have the right to choose, but part of the choice is getting in the booth, even if you see Jesus or not, like Professor Brown Marshall said.
Right. Well, it is important. And I think we've I don't think there's anything more that I can say that really add to the great comments that have already been said, but it is crucial in order to protect the rights that you have as a citizen, in order to decide what monies go where, in order to serve on juries. All of those things are critical in order to create a community. And if you're not doing if you're not voting, then you're essentially giving over your life to someone else, the power in your community to someone else. And we certainly, one of the things that we see when you look going back to 1870 all the way to the present, there's a long history of Black women in particular fighting for control over their communities, fighting for control over the right to vote.
But I do think it should be made a bigger deal. Like, I'm thinking really about what Professor Brown Marshall did. I think that point about it not being a spiritual situation when you go into the ballot, I'm just wondering, Dr. Toya, if we made it a bigger deal when young people turn 18 and they can register to vote. It's kind of like when you go get baptized, people are clapping in the audience, you feel like the heavens are opening up. That if we made it a bigger deal for the next generation, to help them to understand that there's never a more important time when you are an active citizen than when you step in to determine the direction of this country. Do you think that will then help young people get on fire about voting, even if your candidate wins or loses, is part of being a bigger part of the process itself?
You know, Dr. K, I think it's already a big deal. It does come from parents or guardians to teach their children, the importance of voting, or to hear from grandparents or aunts and uncles. I think it is a big deal. I remember voting, and I'm one, I don't early vote. I go on election day because of the thrill of voting then, and I'm the one that's standing in line when they open at 6:30. And I remember young people walking in and they're saying first time voter, and everybody stopping and clapping, and I just thought, that was amazing. And we all wear our stickers, every day, I wore mine for a few days. I think what will help for them to understand is by turning on the TV, watching this trial that's happening, or, watching CNN and seeing other young Black men being killed. I think is understanding how it hurts your bank account when you don't vote. It impacts you in every kind of way. And I think that's what needs to be shared. That's the big deal that needs to be really drilled into young people and why it's important to vote.
Now, before we wrap this segment, I want to first ask a question to everyone, the same question, because it came from the audience. And someone wanted to know, what advice would you give to young women interested in becoming historians? Well, what issue areas are ripe for the next generation to explore? So it's kind of a two-part, and you can decide which question you want to answer. But I think it uniquely drives home why it's important that we are centering the legacy of Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, a Black woman who trained other Black women in study, not just Black women only, but I want to note that she was definitely someone who took a look at my dissertation and told me very clearly what was wrong with it. And then the one paragraph I got right, right? So if I could start with Professor Brown Marshall to take one of those two questions.
I think that as a legal historian, it was very exciting for me starting as a civil rights attorney, going into the academy and now a full professor, to actually say, I want to take the law and look at how the law was used. And what I find is the adventure of it. As was pointed out, I do primary research. I go to the Library of Congress and to the archives. And I also look at legal cases because Supreme Court cases are American history. They are legal history. And so to follow up and look at not just the name of the case, but the people behind it, and to read about their lives and to be able to put that forward is very exciting to me. And I think about the women. I started my book from Queen Nzinga and I go to Shirley Chisholm. So I'm looking at these women's lives and I'm figuring out how their world was at that time based on the primary information that's available. So I say to be an historian is to have an exciting insight into another world, another time, the lives of other people who have lived, and the power of their lives, that they are so interesting that you still want to tell their story 100 or so years later.
Dr. Damon Freeman?
Yes. Well, one of the things I think that's an area that's ripe for the next generation to explore. We still don't know a lot on the state and local level. What was happening in these women's club in the women's club movement, and the connections that it had in the push for voting rights, and how that overlapped in other areas. So, for example, how it overlapped into the anti-lynching movement, how it overlapped in the push for economic independence. There's a lot more that we need to learn that we don't know. And so I would say look for those stories. They're there. It's going to take a whole lot of digging, just like Dr. Penn did a whole lot of digging almost 50 years ago now. And taught us to do a whole lot of digging as well. But that's what I would say, that look for those local stories.
And Dr. Toya Corbett.
You know, as a student, I call myself a child of Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, who, taught us to give voice to the voiceless. And for a young woman aspiring to be a historian, I would say do it. Follow your passion. Because that's what I did. I quit my job and went to graduate school just to study under Dr. Penn. I followed my passion and I found my own voice by uncovering the voice of those women in the archives or in the library. And I would say, look at your local history. I have a desire to write the history of African Americans from the county that I grew up in, that no one has yet, really done anything about. Look at your family history, your genealogy. That will probably motivate you as well. Look for those stories of your family members that your grandmother told you about that no one ever wrote down. Those are things that I think will inspire you and ignite you to keep digging and look for more stories and uncover those voices of our voiceless people.
And I'll add to that, as a historian, what I was told by Dr. Deborah Newman Ham from Morgan State University. She said, if you don't tell our history, if you don't tell your history, someone else will, and they'll probably get it wrong. So you want to make sure if the right story gets out there, you should be the one to tell it. I want to thank you so much for joining us thus far. Dr. Toya Corbett is an Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of North Carolina System. Dr. Damon Freeman, Director of the History and African American Studies Program at University of Maryland Global Campus. And finally, Professor Gloria Brown Marshall, Professor of Constitutional Law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the author of several books, including her most recent, She Took Justice, The Black Woman, Law and Power, 1619 to 1969. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, as we continue to frame our discussion about Black women's suffrage, it is important to think about how far we have come and how far we still have to go. Stacey Abrams served in the Georgia House of Representatives from 2007 to 2017. She's a well-known name now. She served as minority leader from 2011 to 2017. She is the founder of Fair Fight Action, an organization to address voter suppression. Her efforts have been widely credited with flipping Georgia blue. Ms. Abrams was a Democratic nominee in the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election, becoming the first African-American female major party gubernatorial nominee in the United States. Let's take a listen to Ms. Stacey Abrams.
I'm Stacey Abrams, and I'm honored to join the conversation about the state of our union. Growing up, my family went back and forth between lower middle class and working class. Yet even when they came home weary and bone tired, my parents found a way to show us all who we could be. My librarian mother taught us to love learning. My father, a shipyard worker, put in overtime and extra shifts, and they made sure we volunteered to help others. Later, they both became United Methodist ministers, an expression of the faith that guides us. These were our family values: faith, service, education. Now, we only had one car, so sometimes my dad had to hitchhike and walk long stretches during the 30-mile trip home. One rainy night, my mom got worried. Shirt sleeves. When he got in the car, my mom asked if he'd left his coat for me. Our power and strength as Americans lives in our hard work and our belief in more. It is possible, but we do not succeed alone. In these United States, when times are tough, we can persevere because our friends and neighbors will come for us. Our first responders will come for us. It is this mantra, this uncommon grace of community, that has driven me to become an attorney, a small business owner, a writer, and most recently, the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia.
Welcome back. I'm Dr. Kay Wise Whitehead, the host of Today with Dr. K on WEAA, and the founder of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice. On behalf of Maryland Public Television, Morgan State University, and the University of Maryland Global Campus, welcome back to our Conversations for Change, focusing on Black women's suffrage. I'm joined now, back again, by Dr. Toya Corbett, an Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of North Carolina System, a graduate of Morgan State University, and the author of Morgan State University Women, The First 60 Years, 1934 to 1994. Dr. Damon Freeman, the Director of the History and African American Studies Program at the University of Maryland Global Campus, and he's also a graduate of Morgan State University. And we're joined by Congresswoman Donna Edwards, a former U.S. Representative of Maryland's 4th Congressional District from 2008 to 2017. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Congresswoman Edwards, let me start with you. Can you help us to connect the historical fight for Black women to get the ballot to what is happening today?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, and I'm so inspired and learned so much in the earlier discussion. But I think that the connective tissue is that the fight for Black women's suffrage is an ongoing struggle. It's never ended. And for me, that is the most important reminder, because otherwise we might rest on our laurels instead of recognizing, number one, that the vote continues to be under threat, but also that for Black women in particular, that so much of what needs to happen in this country is really dependent on Black women raising those issues. And we do it in some ways through the power of our vote.
As a follow-up to that question, Dr. Damon Freeman, in the documentary we saw at the top of the show, there was a quote, and I'm loosely paraphrasing it, but if you educate a man, you're educating a man. If You educate a woman, you're educating a nation, you're educating a community, you're educating a family. That there is a sense that if we're looking to educate the next generation, we go through Black women and the work that they're doing. So can you talk about the work that Black women are doing on the ground today, helping to organize around getting to the ballot?
Well, that is something that is ongoing. It's been very much a part of the history of Black women and the right to vote for many, many years. And if you look at places like, you already mentioned Stacey Abrams and her work that she was doing in Georgia, that was so crucial to winning that state. There was also a lot of work done to get Doug Jones elected to the U.S. Senate in Alabama in 2018. And unfortunately, he lost in 2020, but a lot of that work depended on what Black women were doing. So it is important. Black women are crucial to Black voting rights and to getting people elected to office. So.
And for everyone who's watching, we invite you to put your questions into the chat box, because we're going to kind of take it forward from the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and really help frame what we're struggling with today and how we can go forward. So Dr. Toria Corbett, I come to you because there's a sense that we're fighting the same struggle over and over and over again. And I try to tell students, it looks similar, but it's not the same. Can you talk about some of the nuances in the fight around the ballot today?
I will. I definitely want to, talk about your previous question too, what Black women are doing now. We're taking souls to the polls. You saw that, as, kind of a theme, particularly for Black women's organizations, sororities, National Council of Negro Women, the Links, what have you. I think that was one of the things that we achieved, is coming together with all these organizations, just as they did when forming the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, and with the founding of NCNW later on. Same thing. We're taking souls to the polls, which helped to put President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris in the White House. And I think now, the strategies, because of how we came together, the nation saw the power of Black women. But then you see what happened in Georgia last week, which takes us back to what was happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Ironically, I was, going through some things today, and I realized in 1871, it was the state of Georgia that started the poll tax. Meaning, if a Black person went to attempt to vote, they check the make sure you've paid your taxes. And of course, we didn't have a lot of money, with sharecroppers or what have you. And if you had not paid your taxes, you could not vote. Or, they made you pay some type of fee, and then you had a literacy test. And so all those crazy things, recite the preamble. I still can't do that, And so, those things, it looks differently now, by saying, hey, you can't give someone water who's standing in line to vote, or, kind of changing the days that early voting happened, or all these things that have been being done. Voter ID, think about the number of people who still do not have an ID for whatever reason. Some people just can't afford to even go pay for a driver's license or an ID card, or with immigrants, or, just trying to do so many things to disenfranchise voters, to keep us from voting. It's the same concept, but just being done differently as it was in the 1800s and early 1900s. And I think about how, for my birthday this past year, my dream was to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I imagine, I'm looking over the water, the river that's there, and I said, people fell off this bridge for my right to vote today. And by us not voting, how are we honoring those lives that were lost? The same things that were happening then are happening now. It just looks differently. And we have to recognize the difference in order to understand what's happening to us.
Then that leads me to back to you, Congresswoman Edwards. As someone who has actually been at the table for many years when laws were being passed, when discussions were being held. Can you talk about the importance of making sure that Black women are at the table and inside the room when it all happens?
Well, when I was elected to Congress, I didn't actually know until after my election that I was the first Black woman to ever be elected to Congress from Maryland. Mm-hmm. Somehow that slipped my knowledge base, but it became a huge responsibility. And I think certainly within our Maryland delegation in the House, I was the only woman in that delegation. And it carried, for me anyway, a bit of responsibility, to not just represent my community, but I was amazed that Black women all around our state looked to me for leadership because they didn't have anyone else. And so I made a point of being at those tables. And in fact, by the time I left Congress in 2017, I was part of the leadership of the House. And that didn't come by accident, but it did come, as many of us know, that sometimes you do have to do double duty, work 2-3 times as hard to make sure that your voice is heard around that table.
And so representation matters, Dr. Damon Freeman. Can we talk about how we can train up the next generation of political leaders who also have a historical bent to understand some of the things that Congresswoman Edwards just laid on the table for us?
Right. Well, I think it's important, and this is not just for leaders, but for students generally, to understand a lot of what went on in the past. So, for example, if we look at the Voter Education Project and efforts like that in the South, and here in Baltimore, if we look at what was done in the 1920s in newspapers like the Afro-American to try and teach people how to vote and the importance of voting. And so there's a long historical record that we can look to for examples of people who basically were involved in voter education efforts dating all the way back to the late 19th century to the present. And you can look to those examples for inspiration and to also raise questions about the things that you're fighting now. So, for instance, one of the issues that came up with the Georgia bill is the question of can the state legislature essentially replace the electoral vote? So the state legislature can simply decide to switch the votes. And so that raises a lot of, well, has this come up before? In what other contexts has it come up before? And so I think we can, there are a lot of historical examples that we can look to in order to answer those questions about training the next generation of leaders and students who are going to be politically active. So.
Congresswoman Edwards, I wanted to just ask you, since Dr. Damon Freeman just kind of put it on the table about what took place in Georgia with SB 202, can you talk a bit about what you think about that and then what you think the impact of that is going to be over the long term?
Well, look, I think as was framed in the earlier conversation, every time that Black people show their power by exercising their franchise, there is a pushback. And I think that what's happening in Georgia, but not just in Georgia, there are over 250 bills that have been introduced around the state legislatures, I think in over 40 states, that would have the effect of suppressing principally Black voters of color. And I don't think that that's an accident. Because Black people have been exercising their power, and particularly Black women. I mean, if you look, whether it's in Georgia or around the country, Black women have played a tremendous role in moving forward our politics, especially in the Democratic Party. I mean, Black women are the surest, most guaranteed vote of the Democratic Party. They form the Democratic Party base. And I think it's only been in recent years that women have decided it's not just enough for us to vote, but we have to be at the table. So more Black women are running for Congress, and they may lose the first time, but they might win the second time, and running for other elective offices. And I don't want to leave young people with the impression that it only matters that you run for and are elected to Congress, or even that you're elected at all. Leadership comes in so many different forms, and the power of the vote comes through the power of our leadership and the ability to organize.
Which is a question that someone had kind of put on the table, asking about how women from anywhere in the country can contribute and come together to break down the barriers to voting. So Dr. Toya, I come to you. So we know when we think about voter suppression and the work to overcome that, people automatically think about Stacey Abrams. But she's not the only one, right? So we have LaTosha Brown and Black Voters Matter. We think about what came out of Baltimore City with Black Girls Vote. I mean, there are all of this work that's being done on every level to secure our unrestricted right of access to the ballot. So what else would you suggest that people do? How do they come together and break down some of the barriers around these 250 bills that might find their way getting passed?
I think one of the number one things that they can do is to be informed. I think because there was so much attention around the last election, people may have let their guard down and not be paying attention, because this is kind of an off election year for president, but it could be a major year in your local elections, again, for mayor, for judges. I know in some states, in North Carolina, judges are elected. And you think about, the impact that could have on your family, from child support, from domestic violence, what have you. Police chiefs who, there's so much focus now on police departments or sheriffs. You have the opportunity to elect those positions. But if we're not paying attention, if we're not voting in primaries, if we're not going to the citizen council or advisory board meetings, if we're not getting involved ourselves, then we're kind of letting our guard down. And that's why I think, Georgia was able to push through what they did last week, because we kind of stopped paying attention to what was happening, because we're still riding on that high. Hey, Sister Kamala's in the White House. We made it. No, we did not. We made it another step. But we still have so much further to go. And if we're not paying attention, things are going to continue to happen across the country. But we have to, not only Black women, but Black men, all people have to be engaged in your community and in the process. And that is by being informed.
Now, I want to say there's a question, Congresswoman Edwards, I'll start with you, that comes up every time I have a conversation about voting. Every single time, the same question comes up, and it's come up multiple times tonight. So I want to ask each one of the panelists, starting with Congresswoman Edwards, it's about the Electoral College. Because we talk about that when it comes in front of our face. We know it's been at least 5 times in history, right? So 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000 with Bush v. Gore, and then of course 2016 with Clinton v. Trump, right? So the Electoral College comes up when that trumps the popular vote. Can you talk about just your position on the Electoral College? And I'll start with you, Congresswoman Edwards, then I'll come to you, Dr. Freeman, and then Dr. Corbett.
Well, I mean, my answer is pretty simple. It is a relic that has been used to obliterate the power of the vote, and it needs to go. I think this last election, actually the last 2 presidential elections, you can see the difference between the popular vote and the Electoral College. I mean, if you go and vote in your local election, if you get more votes, you win. You vote in your state elections, you get more votes, and you win. The only exception to that is running for president, where the Electoral College can trump the popular vote. It is a relic and it needs to go.
Just as thank you so much, Congresswoman Edwards. Dr. Damon Freeman, people want to know the panelist position on this topic.
Yes, I agree 100%. It was an institution that was created to partly to defend the interests of slave owners. It gave an inordinate amount of power to the rural southern states. And it is a relic. It is something out of the 18th century, and there is no need to keep it. Now, that said, one of the things that I think people should also keep in mind is that historically, and I have to go back and check on this just to make sure, but the NAACP at times has supported the Electoral College, and that has come up in the arguments of conservative thinkers as a way to say, well, hey, the NAACP 50 or 80 or 100, whatever ago, supported the Electoral College. So isn't that a contradiction? And I think people need to be prepared for that when that argument does come up. That's the benefit of having that historical analysis. So,
Dr. Toya Corbett?
Very simply, it needs to go. And I don't think, same thing. Historically, it was created. It wasn't created with us in mind. And so that was on purpose. And I think, for the last 2 or 3 elections, people have now paid more attention to it because you probably, like Electoral College, how does it impact me? And when we saw the numbers, I think people are now paying more attention and realize that it does need to go.
Yeah, I think people have Congressman Edwards, please go ahead.
Let me just make a point, because I think that when you look at the way presidential campaigns are run, that it really impacts the way that candidates actually speak to voters and the voters that they speak to. Because if always the play is to win the Electoral College vote, that means that there are whole swaths of the country who never get the benefit of their voice with respect to presidential candidates.
I want to put something on the table. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Edwards, just to follow up on that. In thinking about the last president, and let me tell you why I'm bringing up the name that people said we should never speak again, except during that 4-year period, people were very politically active. That it wasn't this feeling of it doesn't have anything to do with me. We've strolled to the polls. We're with Barack Obama painting the White House black. Like, people started having conversations all the time about political engagement. You had more women signing up to run for office and then people showing up to vote them in. I mean, you had 7-year-olds talking about the president and engaging in these discussions. So my concern, and I'll start with you, Congressman Evans, I'll come back to you. My concern is now that we're strolling to the polls and we're celebrating with pink and green and red and white for me and Marsha Fudge as a Delta, is there a concern that people, there you go, that people won't be as politically active when there's not as much on the line as it was with the former president?
Well, I mean, it's such an interesting question, because I really do think that people do themselves a disservice by only being engaged when there is a president or a former president who was just the most outrageous. There are so many other elective offices that have a direct impact on your day-to-day lives. District attorneys and prosecutors, judges, as has been mentioned before, your county executives and council members. And so I would urge anybody who's thinking, it's all over, we don't have to pay attention anymore. Remember that the rise of an autocrat happened because we weren't paying as much attention as we needed to. And we see democracies that are threatened all around the world because people are not paying attention. So it could happen again. Only next time, maybe it'll be somebody who's not quite as offensive, or somebody who is not as direct when it comes to things like voter suppression and racism. So it could happen again. So we got to be on the lookout, and that means that you've got to exercise the power of your franchise.
Dr. David Freeman, so how do we keep people engaged? Thinking about what the Congressman Edwards just said, how do we keep them engaged when you're now dealing with the president, who I don't have a problem with President Joe Biden, but he's also a little bit more boring, right? It's just not like the last 4 years where the foot has been on the gas. The foot's on the brake. I mean, there are days I go by and I don't think about the president at all. And I get concerned saying this is how you ease up and you turn your attention elsewhere. How do we keep people engaged?
Right. Well, I think certainly one of the efforts that has been done in the past that ought to be repeated again is voter education. I don't think we do a very good job of explaining why voting is important in schools at all levels. We don't do a very good job of explaining the basic structure of the American government. I'm not sure that people fully understand what the judicial branch does and why it's important in all these policy decisions or questions, that whether you're talking about the environment, whether you're talking about labor rights, whether you're talking about voting rights, whether you're talking about the right to sue an employer for gender discrimination. All these things are critical. And so I think we need to do a much better job as educators and as leaders to educate people on why voting is important, why it's critical. So that's what I say.
No, thank you. I want to come to you, Dr. Toria Corbett. Kind of the same question, but what I was thinking about, what was this notion that, remember, you used to always hear keep hope alive. Like, you got to keep hope alive. That a lot of people feel that, okay, the hope has been situated. We've got Kamala Harris, sister from Howard, AKA, Chucks and all. Like, we have Kamala Harris in the room. And maybe it means that we don't have to fight so hard to be attuned to the agenda. How would you answer that, Dr. Corbett?
The election of Kamala Harris to Vice President of the United States, that's one seat. And there are hundreds more, your state senators, your congressmen. And we have to be more mindful of those elections soon. Because when you think about how now, if there's a tie, she's the tiebreaker. But think about all those people who are sitting there that you may have not voted for in a primary, again, that could have taken over, the House or the Senate. And I think with her in office, I call it the Kamala Harris effect. That more Black women have been inspired to run for office because of her. I think more young people will get engaged politically because of her. And just the movement that grew out of last spring and last summer has also inspired more young people to, again, pay more attention to understand the political process. But understanding that vice president role is one seat, it's one vote. It's a powerful seat, but we need more powerful Black women and men occupying more seats.
That's interesting, because I kind of think of it as the Stacey Abrams effect, but in terms of organizing and thinking about it, I wanted to ask one final question to all the panelists, and I'll start with you, Congresswoman Edwards, and we appreciate you joining us here tonight. But if you could just lay out maybe 2 to 3 very quickly, just 2 to 3 issues that you would want the Biden-Harris administration, even with just one seat, the powerful position, 2 to 3 issues that you would want them to address that we really have to focus on over the next 4 years. And I'll go to you, Congressman Edwards, and then I'll come to you, Dr. Freeman.
Well, look, I think that the new administration starting out has identified equity, and particularly race equity, as kind of a hallmark of their administration. I want to see how that works in practice. Equity in housing, in labor, equity in in the financial services sector, all throughout the government. And I think that if he can achieve that, then that will have much more long-term effect for so many Black families. And so I guess I'm looking to see how that happens. And I'm looking to see how the Congress, and particularly the tri-caucuses, the Black Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, the AAPI caucus, push back on the administration to make sure that they live up to their promises.
Dr. Damon Freeman, I'll hear from you, sir.
Yeah, you said, I'm sorry, you kind of froze. 2 or 3 issues that.
Yeah, very quickly, 2 to 3 issues that you think that they should focus on over the next 4 years.
I would second Congresswoman Edwards that equity, I think, is critical. I think we need to do a lot more in terms of looking at the equity question and focusing, laser focus really on addressing equity issues. I would also say I think issues of climate justice are critical here, since issues with the climate tend to impact people of color disproportionately compared to majority white populations. And so I would say at least those 2 things I think should be higher on the agenda.
Thank you. And then Dr. Toya Corbett for the last points.
I'm going to add, in terms of equity, pay equity between, gender, affordable housing, particularly in large urban cities where, just a 1-bedroom apartment, someone can afford that with minimum wage, but affordable housing and more funding for historically Black colleges and universities. Of course, a historic case was, I don't know if I want to use the word one, for HBCUs in Maryland, but my godson texted me that day and said, "Is it still enough?" I said, "That's the question that I asked." So more funding for historically Black colleges, pay equity, and affordable housing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toya Corbett, Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of North Carolina System, a graduate of Morgan State University and the author of Morgan State University Women, the First 60 Years, 1934 to 1994. Dr. Damon Freeman, the Director of the History and African American Studies Program at the University of Maryland Global Campus, also a graduate of Morgan State University, and Congresswoman Donna Edwards, former U.S. Representative for Maryland's 4th Congressional District, 2008 to 2017. Now, as we wrap this important conversation, I am reminded of the words of April Reign. And April is the creator of the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite. But when we were voting back in November, she tweeted, "We're not voting for Biden as much as we are voting for ourselves, for the ability to redefine our future with someone in the White House who we can pressure into change." I'm thinking of civil rights activist Ella Baker, who once said, "Even if segregation is gone, we will still need to be free. We will still have to have everyone have a job. And even if we all vote, if people are still hungry, we will not be free." And finally, I'm thinking of my own Nana, who faced opposition every time she went to the polls. And she said she was not voting for herself or for my mother. She was voting for me. She said, "I'm voting for the children of my children." As we go forward, we understand that we are not fighting or voting for our freedom alone. We vote and we fight for everyone to be free. We do the work for the children of our children. On behalf of Maryland Public Television and Vice President Travis Mitchell, Managing Director Kristen Pinchak, Morgan State University and President Dr. David Wilson, and Special Assistant to the Provost, Dr. Edwin Johnson, and the University of Maryland Global Campus, President Dr. Gregory Fowler, and Director, Faculty Development Training, Don Kemp. The producers, Mallory Pinkett-Pierre and Justina Pollard, thank you for joining us for this important and timely conversation. And if you want to continue the discussion, join me Monday through Friday from 3 to 5 p.m. on WEAA 88.9 FM on Today with Dr. K. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight.